All right. Shall I? Yes. Thank you. I am thrilled to be here. I got in at 8 p.m. last night and have slept for 2 hours and had a half a protein bar. So that's my disclaimer before we get it going. But I'm really excited about this conference, this workshop. And I have to say that it's been a long time coming for many of us who work around and study the internet. I've been on the internet for a very long time, and since before the graphic user interface, so now you know how old I am. And I will say that 10 years ago, when we were talking about things like, can technical systems discriminate, what are kind of the social dimensions and consequences of digital technologies, it was very difficult to gather this many people in a room, quite frankly, because the prevailing logic was that technology cannot discriminate. It is simply a tool, that code is just math, and we still have remnants of these kind of reductionist arguments. But in the end, I think what we find is we are now kind of, we see a global emerging community of scholars, journalists, activists, and people working in companies who are thinking about the kind of broader social implications of the digital technologies and the platforms that we're working with. So I'm going to talk about that. My work has primarily been concerned with thinking up through the complexities of how vulnerable people have to live in a world where certain types of complex decisions are being made that are not transparent, that are not obvious, and yet are kind of still engaging with the consequences of that. Now, 2017 was the year we fell out of love with algorithms. This is one of my favorite headlines of the last couple of years, and I like to think that my work played some small role in being a part of that, as I'm sure many of your work is also doing. I love to share the story that when I was writing the book, Algorithms of Oppression, and I was pitching that to NYU Press, my editor said, there's no way you can name this book Algorithms of Oppression because no one knows what an algorithm is. So I find it hilarious that now, my mother-in-law is asking about the algorithms, and people who don't know what algorithms are like, it must be the algorithm. I mean, it's actually like a cultural joke now. And so that also tells you how long it takes to write an academic book and get it out, that finally we're in this place where we can talk openly about whether there are some other prevailing logics that are at play in the systems that we use. Now, I've already had a sidebar conversation with my new friend Vanud from Google about the fact that I, as he knows, study Google. And one of the reasons why I study Google in particular, although I do look at other platforms, but Google in particular, is because of the way in which the public engages with something like search. Now, I know that a lot of our conversation, because we're talking about content moderation as a focus of this workshop, will be on, again, like social media platforms in particular. But I want to just bring us to search and put search kind of in relief with social media. Because one of the things that we've started to see is that not only is the public hyper-reliant upon search engines for different kinds of information and knowledge seeking. Of course, I come out of the field of library and information science. I have a MLAS and a PhD in library and information science. And so we have been concerned with things like the provision of knowledge in society and the organization of information and knowledge for centuries in the US. And so what we find is that the public is increasingly using search engines in ways that they used to use things like libraries or parents or experts that they knew. And so this means that we need to look more closely at what something like a search engine is doing, because while I think there's increasing awareness that people might be in filter bubbles in social media, or that they might, in fact, be influenced by nefarious actors in social media platforms, people are still turning to search to fact check and verify. And so these are the kind of the relationship in terms of an ecosystem more broadly that I think is important to kind of think about how we might use it. Pew reports that 73% of all Americans have used a search engine, and 59% of them report using the search engine every day. 83% of search engine users use Google, and this is why we study the kind of monopoly leader, because everyone else is trying to be like them. What was very interesting from the kind of last search engine use study by Pew was that users of their study report generally good outcomes and relatively high confidence in the capabilities of search engines. 73% of search engine users say that most or all of the information they find as they use search engines is accurate and trustworthy. 73%. 66% of search engine users say search engines are a fair and unbiased source of information. So this isn't us in the room. This is the people in the study. Okay, we might know better. So let's talk about some of the kind of failures. I think of these as kind of data failures broadly beyond search, but of course, when we think about the linkages between multiple products in a company, I think it's important to, I'm just going to give you a very fast glimpse because I don't have time to share all of the details from the research, but these are ways to just help orient you to this kind of social impact of the failures. So here we have a story that went viral, was in the Washington Post. This was almost 4 years ago now, under the presidency of Barack Obama. So while Barack Obama was in office, there was kind of an onslaught of optimization that was taking place by white nationalists. And by the way, this talk is a super downer. It's about racism and oppression. I know it's too early for that, but I'm just letting you know this is the path we're about to walk down. So what was happening in Google Maps is that when you did a search on the words the N-word house or the N-word king, Google Maps would take you to the White House. And again, this is during the presidency of Barack Obama. And when the activists online started tweeting about it, the Washington Post and other news outlets, U.S. News and World Report, picked up. And there were kind of two interesting things that happened in the kind of response from Google. And this is not unlike any big tech company type of response, which is a very typical. I could have put up an example from Snap. I know Vanud right now is wishing that I had. But I will just say that, the kind of responses that we get often are that, we apologize for any offense this may have caused. And, I'll just say that my husband knows that if he does me wrong and he says, I'm sorry if you're offended, I never really feel fully apologized to. So maybe that's just me, but this idea of like if some random person out there might have been offended by the N-word house taking you to Barack Obama's White House, we're sorry. So, this kind of posture I think is important to notice. More importantly, though, our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. Now, what this part of, I think, the kind of typical response that we get from a big tech company is that this is an anomaly, it's a glitch, it's momentary in an otherwise perfectly well-oiled operating system. And what I tried to do over the course of the years of writing the book, Algorithms of Repression, is gather so much evidence to show that maybe there's more than just a glitch that's happening. Maybe these are not anomalies, but maybe there is kind of a fundamental lack of understanding of how people who are targeted by this kind of abuse come to find these things deeply normalized in their experiences with the internet. Here's Google image search on the keywords unprofessional hairstyles for work. This was a tweet that went viral also a few years ago. When you did this image search on unprofessional hairstyles for work, you were led to almost exclusively black women with natural hair. I wore my professional hairstyle for work today because that's actually the hairstyle I wear every day. But I'll tell you what was quite interesting that users noted online was that professional hairstyles for work was almost exclusively white women with ponytails and updos. So there's the pro tip. It's the ponytail and the updo, and also being white. So one of the things that I think we notice here is this kind of, again, normalization. Now, when you think about all of the ways, and I'll tell you, I do a lot of training with teachers, for example, who are, they are teachers and parents in particular are often telling young people to just Google something. Again, like they're sending them to the dictionary or sending them to the library. But these are the kinds of experiences that people have, and these are quite differential. And I think in relationship to Kat's amazing presentation a few minutes ago, I find this work is in the kind of respectability sensibilities as well, where this is would this be caught or flagged or even seen as a form of abuse or marginalization or quite frankly, racism, and yet we can see kind of objectively that many of us might interpret this in this way, and I think these are things that are important to note. Now, when I started this study, it was the outgrowth of a dissertation where I was looking to see how people are represented in search engines. I spent the first 15 years of my career before I was an academic in advertising and marketing. And as I was leaving the industry, we were just starting to hire programmers to come in on a freelance basis and work in large ad agencies to optimize content for our clients. And we were very clear, we were starting to shift media buying budgets to online advertising, away from traditional media. And the orientation of the ad industry back then and through till today is that search engines are really advertising platforms, and they're really looking to optimize the content of their clients and of products and services. And so it was in that context that I was leaving the industry and going into academia, and I was listening to everyone in academia talking about Google as if it was kind of like the new public library or this new kind of people's search engine. In fact, I was just talking to a librarian a couple of months ago, and she heard my talk and she said, I had no idea that Google wasn't a nonprofit. So we have a lot of work to do, but these are the kinds of ways in which people are oriented to platforms. I started thinking about this kind of political economy of search and what does it mean that we have a driving kind of commercial enterprise reframed as kind of a public information portal or resource. And what were the implications of that, not just for vulnerable communities, but more broadly for democracies. This was the search that really kicked it off. This is really, again, this is a talk that's better for the afternoon followed by an open bar. So I'm just telling you right now that when you did search, and this is all the way back to 2009, this is a result from 2011, when you did a search on the keywords black girls, the first hit was a porn site. And that was followed by a band called the Black Girls from the UK. Has anyone ever heard of this band called the Black Girls? I always feel like, okay, it's like, you're the third person in years. Do you understand? I mean, they're so good at search engine optimization and terrible at music distribution. But there they are, number two. Followed by a porn site, a kind of chat site that's a gateway to porn. The Black Girls Band Facebook page, winning. Followed by a porn site and a blog. All right, so this was for years kind of the way in which black girls were characterized in search. You didn't have to add the words porn, and you didn't have to add the word sex. They were synonymous with these kinds of ideas and representations. It was really, I wrote about this in some various different places, and over the years I've given this, given talks about my work. And what I found was that the same kinds of logics of optimization of content, in reality, black girls do not have the capital to compete with the porn industry in order to recuperate or control their identity. They don't have the demographic numbers either. So if we go with the kind of the two prevailing logics of how search works, which is that those who have the most capital and can optimize content and really take advantage of AdWords win, or those who are in the majority numerically in a given society also can win in optimizing content, then where do people who are both kind of undercapitalized, under-resourced, and not in the majority, how do they fare? And these are the kinds of questions that I raise in my own research. Now, by 2012, the fall of 2012, Google had addressed this. Now when you do searches on black girls, you're no longer met with pornography, and I think that this is important. What my own experience has been is that there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between researchers and people who work in industry where the work that we do can really, outside of the kind of confines of corporate America, help also inform some of the practices that happen and the modifications and changes that come about. And so I think these things are very important, these relationships. If you are kind of less inclined to understand the broader kind of repercussions of what it means to have misrepresentative information circulate in a society about you or the communities that you represent, then I would just point to the very long history. We have about a 50-year scholarly history of studying media misrepresentation. And you can look all the way back to radio and television, kind of predating the internet. The work of Jessica Gandy and Jessica Davis and Oscar Gandy, I think, was really important back from 1999, where they studied media representations and really tied those and made those linkages, as I try to do in my own work, about what it means to be stereotyped and how stereotyping people works in the distribution of resources. And I think we could update this right now in the kind of current conversations about immigration, for example, and the way in which different groups who are migrating, we could look at refugees, we could look at various sorts of vulnerable communities and see the ways in which they are stereotyped in the media and how that affects and is in relationship to things like public policy. So I want to just say that I know that there's been a tendency over time to want to argue that these are just kind of technical fixes that can be made in systems, but I would say that the consequences of both not recognizing that technical fixes need to be made, but allowing the kind of proliferation of misrepresentative information and, dare I say, disinformation too, comes at a great cost, and I think we're experiencing that right now. Now, here was a study by Epstein and Robertson that they did back in 2013. It was like a foreshadowing of the U.S. presidential election. They did a study on voters, and what they did was they, in a controlled study, gave people choices of who to vote for in a political election. And if they showed people positive stories on the first page of search about candidates, people said they would vote for them. And if the first page of search showed negative stories about a candidate, people said they would not vote for them. And what they argued was that search engines should be regulated because they have a dramatic impact on things like democracy, especially in tight races. Here we have this kind of, headline, Google search algorithm could steal the presidency. And, I think we're still studying and trying to make sense of the role of platforms in the U.S. presidential election results. Where my focus has been, while I think many people are kind of concerned with how manipulation might be happening in social media, particularly focused on Facebook and its role in undermining democracy, modern democracies around the world, or the ability to kind of have, again, nefarious actors manipulate that platform. And I think Kat did a really important job of kind of helping us understand the mechanics of how that kind of thing could happen, how people might recognize or not recognize disinformation as they're coming across it, and moderating. Certainly, there's still this kind of opening for understanding better what does it mean when people leave social media to fact check in a search engine. And I think these are the kinds of things that are really important for us to study. You can see that the media picked up right after the U.S. presidential election when Donald Trump was elected, that when you did a search on final election results, it took you, the first search result took you to a disinformation site that reported that Donald Trump had won the popular vote. Now, that is not an alternative fact, as Kellyanne Conway would like it to have us believe. It is a lie. So it's important to understand, again, what does that mean in kind of the social reckoning of facts. And of course, we see so much when we talk about things like abusive language, extremism in relationship to politics. Part of the challenge is that we don't have a lot of clarity about facts, and platforms are playing an important role in thinking about facts. Now, one of the challenges has been the way in which platforms, and this is really not specific just to Google, when platforms are asked about the ways in which their platforms are manipulated. Here we have the case of white nationalists taking over the keywords Boasian anthropology and optimizing content. We know for years that white supremacists have tried to manipulate the keyword Jews, and that's been well documented. Again, having the first page of results show Holocaust denial sites and anti-Semitism, again, presented as fact. And part of the reason is because, again, there's this issue of both capital that communities and actors and organizations can use to help make their content more visible. But also, white nationalists and white supremacists have an incredible amount of technical skill. So these are also some of the challenges when we're talking, if we harken back to the N-word king and the Obama administration and maps. The challenge, though, is that when platforms are asked about this, there is kind of a posture, or at least maybe up until very, very recently, has been kind of a posture that to interfere with algorithmic, kind of automated decision-making processes would be bad technology practice, and that companies, in fact, do not interfere. And the work that I think that Sarah Roberts, one of my collaborators who we'll hear from later today, and that Kat Lowe and that others have been doing around commercial content moderation, why that work is so important and why we need to understand it is because previously, before we knew about these workers who were making these kinds of decisions, what we were left with was a dominant narrative that technologies were simply reflecting back to the public how the public is. But I guess I'm not that pessimistic about humanity and the public yet. And I find it a little bit disingenuous to believe that what we find in platforms is simply a matter of how we all feel. I think that there's a tremendous amount of kind of decision-making that happens. And one of the things that we need to do is keep the pressure on and keep the studies coming that demonstrate kind of the logics of how these things work, because I think that is one of the things that's very helpful in shifting commercial practices. Now, here we have, in the case of Nazis hijacking algorithms, kind of a disavowal of any responsibility on the part of the company, except when the company is doing business in Germany or France, where it's against the law to traffic in anti-Semitism and hate speech, for example. And again, this extends to other companies, eBay and Amazon being early players who, as you know, many of you may know, have faced, significant fines, who cannot sell Nazi paraphernalia, for example, and propaganda. So what we have here is this tension between, I think, again, the global and the local, and these ideas about how companies have to moderate and stay compliant with the law in the countries where they do business and do other things in other parts of the world. In the U.S., it's particularly difficult because, as Marianne Brown in her new book, The Cult of the Constitution, writes about, is that the banner of free speech has been so deeply warped and abused by not just Silicon Valley, but the far right in the United States, that it makes it very difficult to have these conversations about values. One of the things that I certainly try to argue in my own work is that companies are not the public square, and therefore they have values, and they have laws, and they have all kinds of cultural norms that they follow. And one of the best ways that I've heard this talked about recently was at a convening about Charlottesville that the Anti-Defamation League hosted at Airbnb a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that we learned there was that these issues are really ecosystem issues. So, for example, in the organizing for Charlottesville by Unite the Right and the kind of efforts to organize a white nationalist movement visible above ground in the United States, was that Airbnb was able to see Nazis trying to book houses for the after rally kickback, like the after party to the Nazi hate march. And they were able to kind of take a position that might be dangerous for their clients whose homes were in Charlottesville that were being rented out, and so they took a position. But one of the things that we learned was that it was very late in the game because because other platforms were taking different positions around suppressing some of the visibility of the organizing. There was moderation that was happening, but there wasn't a lot of conversation happening across platforms. So where what we might think of as kind of not the dominant 5 big tech companies, but other companies, Patreon, PayPal, Airbnb, Pinterest, these kinds of companies are also deeply invested, I think, in these conversations about abuse and extremism, and there isn't a lot of cross-dialogue happening. And so this, I think, is a huge opening. This is certainly one of the things that Sarah Roberts and I are hoping to help do more convenings at UCLA with industry to talk about how we can approach these things more from a global from an industry, kind of cross-industry perspective, cross-academia. Certainly, you can read more about these. I will not go, because for the sake of time, I don't have time to go into more specific cases, but I would say that you can read about people like Dylan Roof, who also used search to, as he says, develop his racial consciousness, which in the end, Dylan Roof was a white nationalist who shot up Emmanuel AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. And the kinds of challenges that we learned from a case like Dylan Roof is that there's this ability to kind of iterate and reframe and make sense of the kinds of questions that might be asked in platforms or that might be posed is very, very difficult. We've struggled that in other fields too. I think that one of the challenges that we have here is that we think that platforms are somehow going to be, again, technically optimized to impact things like global social inequality, racism, xenophobia, and I would just push back a bit and say certainly there is a role for them to play, but we will probably not swipe our way to social equality. What we have, though, is more data and technology than ever. And since we have been recording global inequality, and of course that is a racialized experience in most parts of the world, since we've been recording that, 2018 was the highest kind of rate of global inequality since we've been keeping records. And so I think we have to ask ourselves the question of kind of what is the role of data and technology in that, because again, for those of us who've been on the internet for a long time, some of these ideas were about technology being some type of equalizer. And I think, in fact, what we see are kind of new neo-colonial patterns of extraction and of waste distribution that are happening back into the global South. I've written some things about this, so we can talk about it certainly in the Q&A. So what are some things that we can do? I think first, Demanding healthy, factual, and socially just information as a pillar of democracy is really important. We have always understood that literacy and high degrees of literacy is fundamentally tied to democracy and democratic ideals. It was really interesting to hear someone at that convening that I mentioned that the ADL did in San Francisco say, as we're moderating content and as we're trying to deal with the concerns, we've never really seen violent extremism from communists. So we're not really, like this idea that there are kind of false equivalencies of bad actors on both sides. Even our president has said, there were good people on both sides. I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves about the morality and the moral frameworks that we're using when we set up these kinds of logics. And certainly, when I hear, ideas from industry about like operationalizing values, I think these are conversations that can be well informed by things like the humanities and social sciences, and that are not simply, again, cannot simply be reduced to data points entirely. We certainly need greater digital literacy of policymakers, and we need to demand better public policy, and there's no better place to say that than in the EU. Because obviously I think the EU is leading in this regard. We need to fund critical digital media research and literacy programs in education. I really do believe, I've been watching what's been happening with scholarship. It has really been people who, as Kat, as you mentioned about kind of the experience of being abused, many of us who are women, people of color, LGBTQ, scholars and journalists and activists have been at the forefront of talking about and making these conversations real. And so I think we need to, of course, we are also the least funded and least supported in the world. Certainly in academia, it's very difficult for us to do this type of work. So we need funding for it, because I've listened to many people in industry say the studies that we do really help inform their work. So, those of us who've worked in industry know there's no time to sit and do this kind of work necessarily. And so it's really important that we're all in this together. I think we need to curate the indexable web, create multiple paths to knowledge, again, reducing kind of the monopoly pathways. And, in this, I'll just say, I know this isn't a focus of this workshop, but I would just plant a seed for us for the day in saying that some of our race to the digital, I think we need to think about how that's implicated in things like climate change, how that's implicated in kind of the over-datification in some parts of the world, and the resource extraction, again, and e-waste that goes into other parts of the world. We might reimagine how we do some of the work that we do if we put it into these larger sets of crises. And so I spent the last summer in Accra, Ghana, studying what was formerly a beautiful, pristine wetland that has become a cancerous, toxic site for the people who work there, dismantling electronics and other kinds of refrigerators and other kinds of things. And I think that we have we would serve humanity well to put our work in relationship to that. All right, thank you.